Hi, welcome to the Nurture Nature Show. I am the Reverend Dr. Laura Kim Joyner of One Earth Conservation and Ministry. I serve as wildlife veterinarian and Unitarian Universalist minister. During our time together, we will have a chance to nurture ourselves so that we can nurture all of nature. Welcome into this community of hope and nourishment and solidarity with all of life. Today's theme is nurturing parrots of Honduras. It's a play on words. That yes, parrots are nurturing for themselves and for us, and we also nurture the parrots. And I was affirmed after I spent over 2 months on the front lines in conservation in Honduras that yes, there is so much joy and success and power and possibility when we nurture parrots and they nurture us in turn. So I want you to come along with the journey to me to Honduras, and we'll be lifting up how you can nurture nature for all of nature. And as I talk, I want you to consider these reflection questions as we see here. How can you use what you know about other species and yourself to nurture nature? And then what challenges do you see when you're doing this work? So let's go ahead and get going on our journey. It's actually a really long journey. I've been doing frontline conservation work for over 30 years in Central America. And one thing I've learned is it can be tough. And so you really want to find ways to nurture yourself because the challenges are great, especially in an area like Honduras. As this map shows here that we have in La Moskitia, in the next slide, we'll show the map. Right, so here's Honduras, and then where the arrow is the region of La Moskitia in Central America. And as we see next, that it is a land of beautiful rivers and mountains and mosquito villages around. And then we have the forest, which levels out into the pine savanna, as shown here. And yes, it is a land of risky and unstable government, and of violence and of corruption. But in the midst of all that are some really, really beautiful creatures, such as we see here. The scarlet macaws is the species that I work with. And so it's abounding with species. And actually in La Moskitia in Honduras, it's the last remaining place where all the species before colonial times can still be found. And some of these species aren't always friendly towards us. So I want to begin with just showing you some of the challenges I had in the first 3 weeks in Honduras here in April, so you can get an idea of what frontline conservation looks like. Okay, the very first day I got here, do you guys know what this is? Do you know what these are? We have them here. We call them chiggers here. And they like to start on your feet, and they like to crawl up, and they don't really like to burrow in. It's a mite. They don't really burrow in till they get about here, and this is the region where they go. And so you're like always scratching and trying to not be too obvious about it, like I'm just shifting my clothes. So I got hit with hundreds of those within the first 2 days. And the other thing I got hit with pretty soon is what we call as no-see-ums here. And they're lower on the ground. So if you're wearing sandals and you forget to put on your insecticide, this is what you get. So I had both these things going on in the very first few days I was there. And then another thing that I hit within the first 3 weeks that I was there is a fire ant attack when I was taking a shower. Now, who saw that coming? They came into the shower, and we have these in the United States too, and they leave behind welts. And this was actually on my feet and my legs. So I got 3 things going on at this time. And then this week we also found, as we see in the next slide, and I actually really enjoyed this, but this could be a little spooky to a couple of people. In the research station that I stayed at was the first ever documentation of this species. It's a large fruit-eating bat. And he liked to just roost right outside the laboratory where I was doing my veterinary clinic work and would poop all night. And so in the morning I would have to step over, possibly rabid feces from the bat to get into the laboratory. But it was not a vampire bat, so there was no chance that we were going to be attacked. Oh, righty. So here you've seen the list. This is just what the work. Let's continue on with the list here. Okay, then another skin thing I got. This was all new. I had not had this skin thing. So here we are. We're walking towards an nest tree, which you see way in the distance there for scarlet macaws. And we're in very tall grass. Well, I happened to be walking through some grass, as we see in the next shot, and it cut my skin. No big deal. But this grass had some type of allergen in it, and it puffed up and turned red and blue and stayed open for several weeks. Okay, so all this is going on. This is just now in the first 2 weeks that I've been there. And then also during this time, what happened, as we see next, is all around me was an outbreak of flu and diarrhea. I did not get sick, but we were constantly taking people to the hospital, people we worked with. And why was that? It's maybe because the water levels were low. And as we see next, that the people are drinking from the rivers and the contaminants are higher. So there were some deadly, near deadly incidents for the children and some of the adults in our area. But I did escape that. And then the perennial thing that we always face when we go down to Honduras is problems with transportation, as we see in the next slide. So within the very first couple of weeks, there we are with a flat tire underneath a nest tree, a scarlet nest tree that we'll be climbing for our science work that we do. Thank goodness we had a spare. But then we got a flat on the way out because they're really old tires, a really old truck. And then we're driving around with no spares and just crossing our fingers. So we go into the local town and we get more spares, and they both go flat. And then we go back in the town and we buy a brand new tire, which people left behind. And so we got stranded a lot with flat tires and also mechanical breakdowns, such as we see here. We lost our clutch in the middle of the road. Next slide, please. A couple hours away, and it took so long to repair this, as we see in the next slide, that we're way out on a road where there's no traffic, and we just have to cook dinner for ourselves. We just don't have the funds right now for a really good, reliable vehicle. And so, as we see in the next slide, we need reliable vehicles because this was the season of wildfires. And so they would come right up to the road. They would sweep across us when we were climbing nests. They'd be up this high. Sometimes they were way up over the top of the pine trees. And you'll get a vision of this in the upcoming video that shows how we had to gun it through a certain spot to get past this wildfire. Right, so we just came through the wildfire and the bugs and the broken down truck. Why do conservationists want to do this? Why do we want to do this? Well, clearly for these birds, their beauty, and to preserve them. And we want to know everything we can about them so we can have a good management plan. So let me tell you about some of the things we learned from the scarlet macaws this year. They really are bonded to each other. They are very strongly bonded. I have seen that if one mate dies, the other will become depressed and no longer eat and be quiet. They also are bonded to their chicks. And some parrot species name their chicks. They actually have specific names for their chicks. They bond to their eggs, and they're really, really smart. Some parrot species, they put around the intelligence of a 4 or 5-year-old child. And so they nurture each other. And one way that we really see this, as we see in the next slide, is that part of our work is to climb parrot nest trees. This is a pine tree, and there are cavity entrances, and the parrots are down below. And so when we climb these trees, sometimes the parents are there. And as we see next, some parents are really calm, and they just sit there and they watch us. The majority, though, are not. They want to protect their chicks and their eggs and their trees, and we do no harm. We're only examining, taking pictures, and maybe lowering the chick down for 10, 15 minutes to understand them. But other birds, such as we see next, are flying around and they're antsy and they're calling and they're circling the tree, as we see in the following slide with the climber up in the tree. They're circling, and how do they know that we're there? Well, the chicks will be calling. And so the chicks are calling, the parents are calling, and all this while we're climbing a tree, as we see next. It's very disrupting for the family. We don't know how disrupting. I mean, they always return to their chicks, but they care. They're willing to get really close to us so they can protect their chicks. And so I want to tell you a story about one family of macaws, how much they care for their eggs. So there was this one nest. Let's go ahead and see the next slide. That this one pair is circling and calling and landing in a tree and circling again. And then another pair calling off in the distance came. And so we have two pairs circling us. They don't even know if they're related or they're chicks from a previous year. But they, as a group, care for their own, whether it's their own relationships or not. So let me go ahead and tell you that story I wanted to tell you about what one female did. And we see her in the next slide. And we went to go investigate this tree because there was evidence that there might be nesting, but it was late in the season. It was May, and they should have quit laying eggs by now. But she was acting like she had eggs or chicks. And so we went up to the tree, and what did she do? She went right into the nest cavity. We walked up to the tree, and she didn't leave the nest cavity, even though it was at risk to her life, because people there do cut down trees and do shoot macaws. But she wouldn't leave, even though we were there. So we immediately left, because when macaws are laying eggs, or in the first trimester of incubation, when the eggs are really new, they can abandon their nest. So we got out of the way and came back about 2 or 3 weeks later. And sure enough, here's what we saw. Here's a one-day-old scarlet macaw chick. And she didn't abandon her nest. And she stayed. And she took care of this one chick so late in the season. And then we came back the next week, and this is what we saw. A scarlet macaw chick that's really healthy and doing just fine. And I got a picture just the other day, and the bird's about 6 weeks old now, due to fledge in early September. So they care for their eggs. They care for their chicks, and they care for each other. So let's go ahead and understand a little bit more about, well, why do they care for each other? And is it only for their kin? Let me tell you a story about a red lord Amazon. This is a young red lord Amazon chick, and we've just climbed a nest, and we're studying the chick, and we'll put the chick back. Well, one time, the climbers went by a tree, and a red lord Amazon chick just popped out of the nest. And they couldn't put the chick back in. They were afraid it was going to pop back out. So they came to the rescue center and brought the red lord chick. And I thought, oh no, we don't want to take them away from their parents. But we had to at that point to keep the chick safe. And so we had to take care of the chick. And you can see in the following slide, hand feeding the chick to make sure that the bird's going to be doing okay. And I decided, well, let's give it to a family who can take care of the bird and release it. So we gave them this chick just temporarily to Pascasio, in the next slide, who's the president of the community. And I told Pascasio, this bird can fly. It's a young bird. It's anxious. It's ready to fly. Don't let him out to your house, because you'll lose him. And he'll go into the forest by himself. And without parents, they're prone to predation. But sure enough, after a couple of days, the bird got out and goes in the top of a mango tree outside of the house. Can't get the bird down. And the bird's hungry. And by evening, the bird is calling and making baby chick sounds. And just as the bird was doing that, a whole flock of about 80 red lord Amazons came over. And what happened is one pair heard the chick calling and swooped down from the flock and landed in the mango tree. This is a wild pair. And then you know what else they did? As we see next, they fed that chick. Now, we don't know if it was the parents that maybe heard their chick, or it was another set of parents just saying, we're going to take this chick. And you know what they did after they fed the chick? They called to the bird, and the chick took off flying, and they flew underneath, bumping the bird up until it could make it into a safe tree to perch. And so they really care for their own kind, perhaps not even when they're related. But sometimes parents don't have a chance to care for their chicks, and the bond is broken. This happens during poaching. And there's been significant poaching in Honduras, just wiping out the parrots. So let me tell you the story about Rosa. Rosa was a young scarlet, is a young scarlet macaw, as we see here in this photo. I don't know what happened to her, but often poachers will chop down a tree because they can't climb it to be able to pull the chicks out. But when she was confiscated and rescued and brought to the rescue center, she had 2 broken legs and 2 broken arms as being her wings, we would say. And she was really sad. But they mostly healed up, and I didn't meet her until she was about 6 months old. And as we see here in the following picture, Rosa is a very sad bird. I don't know if you can see this for her, but she doesn't have all her feathers. She's got a fly on her beak. She's thin, she's crying, she's got an ear infection, she has a respiratory infection. I thought she was going to die. And so we treated her, and I had to go. And so the people there continued to treat her and care for her, and they did a wonderful job. And so here's Rosa when she's about a year old, and you can see here in the next picture how she's got her tail feather in, and she can protect herself, and just she's being a macaw, except she still can't fly, and she walks like this because her legs are crippled there. Her feet don't work, and I know that she has some pain. So the parents couldn't take care of her, but the people did in the village. And you know what happens? It's not that Rosa's life is a loss. She can only fly a couple feet. She can't walk really well. She's about 3 to 4 years old now. But here's one thing that Rosa does. She welcomes new macaws into the rescue center, as we see from this picture. This was a macaw that we gave the name Mocoron. Very uncomfortable coming into the rescue center. Rosa went right up to this bird, and within an hour, they are the best of friends. So Rosa, even though she is crippled and never be able to fly, can nurture others. It's a story for us. Even though we feel that we have a lot of limitations, we really can nurture and welcome others. And so let us continue to tell these stories, as we see in the next slide, that this nurturing can come from people to take care of Rosa. This is Anaida, the director of the rescue center in La Moskitia, Honduras, taking care of Rosa. And she said, my heart breaks when I see birds like Rosa come in, and I have to take care of them. And it isn't just Rosa, it's other birds too, as we see next, that many birds come in unable to fly with broken wings, and they need a lot of help from the villagers and from people like us that send money and our time and our resources and our veterinary care as a wildlife veterinarian to help them. And I just have to ask the global community and you and us, isn't it time we quit breaking bones of birds? Isn't it time that we did that? But it's hard to do because we have a desire. We want these birds in the pet trade. And so as we see in the next slide, it's hard for us to do, it's hard for them to do. How do we make decisions based on our resources of money and time and our desire, balancing all this? So here are the scarlet macaws that have been liberated and fly in every day to get food. But before we had an official rescue center, there wasn't enough food, and they told me they had to decide between feeding their children or the birds or themselves. And it was a tough call. People and birds went hungry, let alone feeding their dogs. And so they had to make some tough choices, as we all do, on how can we nurture ourselves and nurture the rest of the world. But we do find a way. And Anaida, the director of the rescue center, this year told me a story, as you can see here in the next slide. And this was a story that I actually experienced myself. This is Loli, a young yellow-nape Amazon. She's about 2 months of age. And can you see how she doesn't have all her feathers? She should be completely feathered and flying, but she can't hold her head up. One of her legs is broken. A cat bit her on the back. Her feathers are undeveloped. She can't breathe, and her eyes are closed. She's dying, basically, is what this is. And then what we did, as you can see in the next slide, we were able to look at her feces, and we found out, if you'll go ahead and show the next slide, that she's full of parasites of tapeworms. And so we treated her, and she got better that first year, as we see in the next slide. And treating Loli, she's feeling a little better, and there is the person who takes care of Loli. Now, Loli was poached from the wild, but the people don't know enough or have enough resources to really take care of these birds as they learn that they shouldn't be poaching them. And there's reasons for that. So we want to take care of Loli and the birds, but we have to take care of the family. And so what we found out with this parrot, when the village found out that she had tapeworms, they were afraid that she was going to give it to the village children. And it turned out the village children did have tapeworms, not of the same kind of Loli probably, but other parasites as well. They had never been treated. They were thin, they had swollen abdomen. So in the next slide, we can see how we went and we found a nurse to come to the village, and she treated everybody in the village for parasites. We have to take care of the people so they can take care of the birds. The health is related, and not only in medicines, but in employment. So the owner, the companion of Loli, works for the conservation group, or did for the last 2 years, as we see in the next slide. And we have to provide economic resources for the people and education so they can make the choices and they have some economic room, some financial room, because as in this family, as we see next, they're taking care of so many children and elder adults, and health care is really rare and expensive for them. So we have to treat everybody. And that's not always easy to do, as we see in the next story. This is Oneida, the director of the rescue center. And so she's been at this like 3 or 4 years now, and there she is with Rosa. And one day I noticed she was really sad, and I said, "What's wrong?" She said, my mother is really sick. She's in Nicaragua, and she may die, and I want to go see her. And I said, "Sure, go. That'd be fine. We'll be fine." And we just got in a huge shipment of confiscated birds, and Oneida said, "I can't leave these birds to go see my mother." So she made a choice to take care of the birds, and the sadness of the separation from her mother was very evident. But I just talked to her spouse yesterday, and her mother is all better. So we have to make tough choices. We all do. And so let me tell you another story about tough choices. In the next slide, there was a group of yellownape Amazons that came in. They had been rescued, and look what a terrible cage they're in. So they came into the rescue center, and in the next slide it shows how we built this cage really quickly to be able to house them, as we see next. But it wasn't quite finished, and they could get out a little bit. So we paid a couple children to make sure the birds couldn't get out, as we see next. And while they were working to protect the birds, we played with them, and we mixed English and Mosquito and Spanish and Parrot, and we had a grand time. But one day, the little boy right here, he brought me a little parakeet, and it was of the species as we see in the next slide. It is an olive-throated parakeet, but it was a baby. It was walking on the road by itself. It turns out the bird had gotten away from a family that had rescued the bird. The bird had been in the line of a wildfire, and the son worked for the fire brigade and rescued the bird. And so I took care of the bird for a couple weeks, as we see in the next slide. I'm hand feeding it a formula, and I had to do that because the family had some severe illness, and they had crops to take in, so they couldn't take care of the bird. But eventually I was able to return the bird to the family. And then one morning, here's what I saw, as we see next. The birds are free flying. They're still young, they're still babies, but they're free flying because they say, "We will not clip the feathers of these birds. They will return to the wild." And there's a second chick that had been abandoned in another house that they had rescued. So the birds flew in to be fed, and as you see in the next slide, the delight of the family about being with these birds. So in the next slide, we see the mother and the son just so happy and grateful for these birds. And then let's look at the next slide where we have the spouse. They love these birds. They will return them. They will liberate them. And one of the family members even told me, "And I'm no longer going to eat them either." They've made such rapid progress in nurturing themselves and nurturing the birds. And yet it's still tough. Let us see the next slide then. Because we want these birds. We want to bring them into our lives. And so people bring them in so they can play with the children, which you will see in this video.
Levanta la huevo.
Okay, otra vez vuelta.
Otra vez, recostate, pero volteando a ver, mami. Qué bonita salió. Ajá. Muy bonita. El gallo salió. Ajá, ajá. Ahí está acostada. El gallo salió.
¡Ay, no me muerdas! ¡No me muerdas! Súbete otra vez. Me anda siguiendo. Está gato.
Allí. Volteate aquí la cara, la cabeza.
Ya la di vuelta. Muchinera ahí está.
So we all want birds in our household. Look how lovely that was, but it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to the birds, such as these cockatoos that are stored and transported in plastic bottles and die so the world can have them as pets and in their collections. It breaks the birds, and it breaks people, such as in this story. In the next slide, there was a poacher in Honduras that climbed a tree to take the scarlet macaws, and he made a mistake and he fell. And he died at the base of the tree. And the next slide shows how the people came to mourn him and had a graveside marker. One of the chicks died and he died. And I ask you, isn't it time that we quit breaking the bones of people and of our hearts and nurture ourselves so we can nurture all of life? And how do we do that? Well, you may have known that I've told you the story before of Tomas, as we see in the next slide. He showed me the scars where he was shot 4 times. People tried to kill him because he was protecting the birds and the trees of his forest. And he risked his life to return 5 months later to help us with the parrot project. And I said, Tomas, why are you risking your life for the parrot? And he said, Doctora, everything is at risk. So I am willing to risk everything. The birds don't make it, neither do my people. And that is the wisdom that motivates us in Guatemala. Because as we see in the next slide, or in Honduras, our work is to nurture the birds, nurture ourselves, nurture the people, so we can all flourish. All needs matter. We're all in this together, and that is our work at One Earth Conservation. And it's been successful this year. So that's part 2 of this show. Please stay tuned for next month, where you will see the results of our work and the kind of work that we do, and specifically there. And before we meet next month, after I finish talking, there'll be slides for reflection questions and study questions, and also an upcoming Nurture Nature webinar where we work with people here on how they can nurture themselves to nurture all nature, and all kinds of resources to be connected. So do scroll through after we're done. And so now we are done, and the journey, at least for this month, has finished. So let me leave you with these words from Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Go in peace and love.